Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. President Trump has frozen federal research funding for a number of American colleges and universities. He's issued demands from many of these schools in exchange for federal dollars. Harvard has particularly been in the headlines this week. In light of this, Forbes has produced a list of 39 institutions that have the ability to join Harvard in its resistance to President Trump. Joining me now to discuss this list and her article with it is Emma Whitford. She is a staff writer covering K through 12 and higher education. Emma, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Maggie.
So let's set the table before we get into this list. What exactly is the tussle between American universities and President Trump? What's going on here?
So, President Trump has been coming after American universities through a variety of different channels. One of the more recent ones is he's been freezing federal funding or threatening to do so for some prominent research universities under the guise that they have somehow failed to protect Jewish students from anti Semitism. There's a lot of arguments about the legality of those claims, and those are being battled out in the courts. But in the meantime, universities are risking losing billions of dollars in federal funding for research.
And I mentioned in my intro that Harvard made headlines this week. President Alan Gerber basically said he'd refuse to cave to demands that the university eliminate diversity programs. What else did Harvard say this week, and why is it such a big deal?
Yeah, not very many colleges so far have stood up to Trump and said, we're not going to do the myriad demands that you've given us. Do what you will. We're going to keep our diversity programs. We're not going to review academic programs. We're not going to punish students. They've been issuing a slew of different things that usually the federal government would not be involved in. So Harvard's sort of the first one that's gotten a specific list of demands and decided not to do it. I will note that Princeton University has been pretty outspoken as well, but they have yet to receive any sort of specific demands from the Trump administration.
So we're getting basically this situation where an American president is threatening American universities financially. And within the course of academia, we know this, some universities are better positioned to have funding pulled than others. Can you talk about the conversations you've been having with editors and what led to this list of 39 Trump-proof universities?
For sure. I want to start with the caveat that no one's really Trump proof, but these are sort of the 39 schools that probably stand the best chance to standing up to Trump and to figure out who they were. We wanted to take a look at their financials. So one of the first things we considered was their endowment. So how much money do they have sort of to keep operations running into perpetuity? I will note that endowment is different than a savings fund or a rainy day fund. They can't just tap into that money and move it. So Harvard couldn't say, we're going to take 2.2 billion from our $53 billion endowment and cover the research funding. They'd have to jump through a lot of hoops if they wanted to use endowment funding on research. Usually it's earmarked for things like student aid or a faculty position. They'd have to go back to the donor, whoever gave that specific money, and sort of ask if they can reallocate it to something like research, which is possible but difficult. And then another thing that we were looking at was their financial grade, which is a list that Forbes puts out every year. We evaluate private colleges on a variety of metrics, for everything from endowment size, return on assets, to how much are they discounting tuition, what is their admissions yield, to sort of determine the overall financial health of the school. So we were looking at colleges that also had pretty high grades. I think all the schools on our list of 39 are B plus or above.
And does that grade incorporate the credit rating on the institution? Because your story notes that Harvard has a AAA debt rating and also relatively little reliance on federal support for operations compared to others. How important is that debt rating in this calculation for the 39 schools?
We actually don't include the debt rating in that calculation. That's just something I wanted to note about Harvard and a handful of the schools on our list is that if they want to access debt, they can do so pretty easily. Um, we do factor into that list the reliance on federal dollars. So a lot of those schools, it makes up less than 20% of their operating revenues every year. So that could be things like Pell Grants, which are grants for student tuition that most schools receive. And then a lot of it is also research funding from NIH or NSF. But the schools on our list have other revenue streams, things like tuition that they can sort of lean back on if their federal funding is to decrease. So a lot of them are small private liberal arts colleges that really focus on undergraduate teaching and don't do as much research as some of the big public R1 universities.
Interesting. So a more research-focused university might not be on this list?
Right. So there are some on here, a lot of the big private schools like Harvard, like Washington University, Vanderbilt, that Johns Hopkins, schools that really focus on research. You will see on there, but that's because they are also so wealthy on their own. But a lot of the public schools that have a little bit smaller endowments and still do a ton of research and get a ton of funding from the feds, they wouldn't be included on this list.
So let's get into it. I won't make you do all 39 from memory, but can you take us through some of the highlights of this list of colleges that have the endowment, the financial health, and the revenue to push back against Trump's overarching federal funding stipulations?
For sure. So you will see a school like Princeton University on there. They have the highest endowment per student. So it's not the largest endowment in total, but if you look at how much money they have for their relatively small enrollment, it is larger than any university in the country. So they're pretty well off. And even though they get about 43% of their operating revenues from federal dollars, their president's already been very outspoken about not wanting to keep Trump. So we wanted to keep them on the list because we expect them to continue to push and try and outlast any sort of federal overreach. And then you've got some small liberal arts colleges like Pomona College, Principal College, Williams in Massachusetts, and those are all pretty focused on the undergraduate teaching experience. They only get a few percent of their revenue from the federal government. They're not doing a lot of research. And then they also are very, very independently wealthy. So we expect that they would be able to outlast 4 years of any federal disruptions. Um,
Let's get into that endowment per student really quickly. So I understand some commenters are saying, you can't just look just at endowment. So
right.
why is it important to break that big endowment figure down to the endowment per student?
Yeah, so if you think about schools like Columbia University, which has already caved to some of Trump's demands, or Cornell University, they have these really large endowments, but they also enroll so many students that those endowment earnings just aren't going to go quite as far because their expenditures are so much higher. So then if you look at a school like Princeton that does have that really high endowment per student number, they've just got so much more saved compared to what their relative teaching expenses are, that it would go a lot farther to help them.
One of the figures here that's really interesting to me, a longtime Forbes staffer, I love the math, I love the numbers, is federal funding as a percentage of operating revenues. And some of these schools, it's remarkably little. Grinnell is 1.4%, Williams 2.3. Swarthmore College, from where I'm from in Pennsylvania, is 2.1. I'm surprised by some of these figures. You report on this on a regular basis. Did any of this surprise you, or is this kind of standard fare?
A little bit. I'll note that these numbers are a little bit crude because I use federal data to calculate these, and it doesn't split that up into different types of federal money. So I can't tell, what is research, what is student grant aid, that kind of thing. Um, but schools like the ones you mentioned, like Grinnell or Swarthmore, they're very reliant on tuition. Schools or students pay a pretty high price tag to attend. So a lot of their funding is coming from that stream and less so from the federal government, which would be supporting a lot more research behind the scenes kind of things.
What surprised you about this list that you put together here? Was there a name of a university or college that once all the math was done, you were like, wow, I did not expect to see that name here?
Yeah, there was one that surprised us all, I think, which is Soka University of America. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's very tiny. It's in California, and it's very wealthy compared to the number of students they have. It's supported by a Japanese Buddhist sect that has given them quite a bit of money and seems to operate pretty independently. So that was kind of a strange, cool name to see on here. Um, And there's also a few just smaller specialized schools like the Juilliard School, Curtis Institute of Music, that seem to have pretty low enrollments, but pretty healthy endowments and low reliance on federal dollars, so they'll probably do fine as well.
Were there any schools you expected to see come out in this ranking that ultimately did not make the cut?
I was a little bit surprised not to see Columbia or Cornell on here. Um, I knew that they had high enrollments, but I thought their endowments were big enough that they would still make this list. So it was a little bit eye-opening to see just how vulnerable they still may be, even though they are seen as these really prestigious, untouchable schools. It's it's precarious, even for the big guys like Harvard. I mean, they're standing up, but it's tough for everybody.
What you said about how endowments are earmarked, I think is really interesting and also important. Did any of your sources talk about how long it would take to perhaps unearmark those dollars from the endowment in order to make up for any federal funding dissipation?
It would really vary. I think it would depend on the scale of how many people you're approaching to talk about this. I asked my sources if there had been any historical events where schools have had to do this in the past. And there really haven't been, except if a school is somehow in dire financial circumstances for some other reason. So maybe they're facing closure and they want to tap that endowment more so than they would uh, year to year. Then they might go back to donors and talk about that. But it would involve a lot of man hours, a lot of paperwork, and a lot of legal hoops to jump through. So it's not necessarily a practical solution that colleges have, but it could be an option.
One of the other factors that comes up in your piece is international students, which you mention when talking about MIT. MIT did not make this list of Trump-proof universities. So I'm wondering, how does a college or university's international student population play into its ability to counteract the effects of the administration?
Right. So the Trump administration has really gone after international students. They've been revoking visas all over the place with loosely justified reasoning or sometimes no reasoning at all. And this is a problem for colleges financially because a lot of them rely on international students to come and pay full tuition, which even though private colleges have these really high tuition rates, like somewhere in the 70,000, 80,000 range, most domestic students don't pay that. They get some sort of merit scholarship that discounts that rate. So maybe they're paying only $40,000 a year out of that $70,000. But international students don't tend to get that kind of financial aid. So schools rely on them to pay that full fare, and that sort of works out to help discount for domestic students. So if they lose that stream of enrollment from international students, it's another financial hit that they're having to deal with.
I'm going to ask a question that might be a story idea for you in the future, but back when I was covering student loans and student debt in 2013 and 14, something that came up a lot was the idea of net tuition revenue and then how much aid is left over from the money a college has, I'm speaking super crudely, to give aid to students. Have any of your sources indicated that schools could start offering less financial aid, fewer scholarships, fewer grants in order to protect their revenue stream, their bottom lines from federal action?
I have been asking about that, and they're in a bit of a pickle because as much as, yes, it would save them money to start offering less grant aid to students, they also would not necessarily be able to attract that student. So if you're going to offer 50% aid on a $80,000 tuition fee, so the student's only paying $40,000 to attend, they might opt to enroll because they can afford that. Whereas if you're only offering a 25% scholarship on the $80,000 fee, and they can't necessarily afford the $60,000 bill, then you're not getting any money from that student at all. So it's not necessarily a good idea for them to decrease those discounting rates because it might just end up to enrollment declining, and then they're facing an even greater financial challenge.
That's one of the big questions that remains. And as you described that situation, I'm also picturing a homogenization that could occur to some student bodies, right? If you're offering less in grants and aids, which would perhaps go towards the administration's goal of rolling back DEI, just perhaps in a way that was not intended, or at least we can't say if it was intended. But Emma, as we look towards the future, towards the end of the school year, what are the questions that are at the top of your mind and that you'll be asking sources in the days and weeks to come?
Yeah, it changes every day because there's always new news coming from this administration and how colleges are responding. One of the things I'm looking at right now is what role philanthropy might play in this. In the past, the federal government has always been sort of the main funder of research at universities, but maybe we'll see foundations start to step up and try and fill some of those gaps. Um, Another thing I'm wondering about is how this is going to impact international student enrollment. There's been a ton of speculation about it. And this month is when students will start putting down their deposits. So we'll get to see if there's actually going to be a decline if students from outside the US don't want to come here anymore, and what kind of impact that will have on classes next fall.
Of course, May 1st is decision day, is that right?
Yes, it is. It's
So
coming up.
we'll have data pretty soon after that.
Yeah, they tend to release numbers throughout May. So
All right, well, we'll have to have you back to give us an update based on what you're seeing then, because I am also interested in these questions and their answers. But before I let you go for now, is there anything else you want the Forbes audience to know about your story on these Trump-proof universities?
I don't think so. I think we've covered most of it. Thanks, Mary.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.